All right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this special hurricane seminar in June. We want to start the hurricane season right. So we want to give everybody some good information from different points of perspective for different cities in Dade County. We have a really good couple folks. We'll introduce in a bit, but just a couple of minor things. I just want to, again, to introduce myself. My name is Diego Vanderbeest. I'm the secretary for the LIF Miami-Dade chapter. Today's format is going to be a little bit different than we've done in the past. Typically, we'll do a full introduction for everybody and proceed that way. But today, we're just going to do a quick introduction, have them kind of talk about themselves and what they do at the city, answer a couple of questions. And then once everybody has a chance to go on the panelist side, we're going to do a full panel discussion with a couple of additional questions. And then hopefully we have a little bit of room at the end for some Q&A. So please, I encourage everybody to please use the chat. We'll try to monitor that as much as possible. Henry's going to help me out. And we'll hopefully have a little bit of time afterwards to have a Q&A after. Just a couple of things as well. At the end, we're going to have a survey. So once we finish, if you could just please stay on, you should receive a link. And I know that's a big deal for Henry and his staff. Certifications for LIF is going to be in the first week of August. We're going to be sending an emailer later the next couple of weeks with specific dates and times. And then one last thing is I just want to add a little disclaimer for today's presentation that a lot of this stuff we're going to be talking about is mostly, it's good information, informative, but it's also, I would consider public opinion that afterwards we're going to send an email with some specific information, but I just urge everybody to check with their local municipality because we're going to be having a lot of different representatives from different cities, municipalities, but not everyone is in the same page. So just again, just a little disclaimer, it's really important. So today's panelists, we have Lazaro Quintino and Luis Moreno from Miami-Dade Durham. We have Quatisha Oguntuyimbo Rashad from the city of Miami. Hopefully George Rivera will be joining us. He's from the city of Coral Gables. And we have Omar Leon. He was formerly with the city of Miami Beach, but he has a lot of good knowledge. And we really wanted to make sure they get represented. So to start off with, I'm going to quickly introduce again Lazaro Quintino and Luis Moreno from Miami-Dade County, Durham. And just a couple of questions we really want to answer is, are permits required for tree removals after storm for residential and commercial properties? If so, is there a cost? Do we have references from storm tolerances for trees and palms? So please go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, all. Let me start by wishing everybody a early happy Father's Day Sunday to all the dads that are joining us today. And, you know, I hope you guys either already ate lunch or grabbing lunch as we speak, or maybe are saving your appetite for a little bit later. Yeah, my name is Lazaro Quintino. I'm the manager of the Tree and Forest Resources section of Miami-Dade County. I've been with the county 20 years within the Natural Resources division, and I've been a certified arborist since 2004. Now to answer, you know, this question, are permits required for tree removals after storm for residential and commercial? I mean, our code already exempts trees that are destroyed or effectively destroyed by an act of God. So if the tree was destroyed or effectively destroyed by an act of God, you know, the tree split in half, it toppled over, all the primary branches were ripped off in the case of a really, really strong hurricane, then those trees are exempt from requiring a permit. So to answer that specific question related to trees that have been effectively destroyed, you know, a permit's it's not required, and obviously there's no cost involved in that. I don't know if Luis wanted to provide. Luis is my right-hand man in the county. I don't know if he wanted to provide any other information.
I wanted to mention a couple things, Les. Hi, this is Luis Moreno. I'm the supervisor of the tree permitting program in the county. And well, my background, aside from being an arborist and a LIF certified, is on ecology. And, you know, I kind of gravitated from the natural environment into the urban environment. And many things apply, many others are a challenge. But here's my suggestion on that. Yes, there's an exception for this effective destruction, but documentation is critical of that effective destruction, because cases are open and reports are given, complaints are given, and we have to respond. And we always advise property owners to document that kind of damage and to get professional opinions. That's when arborists are so important when they do their assessment. It might look like an effective destruction, but it might not be, you know, for professionals that do the assessment. So I always warn people not to, I mean, if in doubt, if it's not obvious, and always to document the kind of damage they have. And if it's not extremely obvious, like a total destruction, completely uprooted and falling, or just that it lost the bole, the canopy completely was snapped in half, things like that, just to get a professional opinion, just to seek in the website for arborists and to ask for that opinion if it can wait. And then you have that justification to apply for the exemption in the county areas, non-incorporated Dade County, or those municipalities that the county runs the tree permitting program. So that's the detail I wanted to offer. And another thing related to this is that sometimes we tend to put it in the typical setting of a right-of-way tree, or maybe a specimen tree in a single family residence in some of our suburban areas, neighborhoods. But we have a variety of land uses. We have multifamilies, we have commercial property, industrial, and this is not a free-for-all. Let's just knock down trees, and just because they are exempted from permitting, you don't need to replace them according to the landscape, the minimum landscape requirements that you have to maintain in these properties with common areas and easements. So it is important also to point that out, that just because you don't need a permit doesn't mean that you don't have to replant or replace that landscape tree. For single families, yes, there are exceptions and we don't have a mechanism, but where minimum landscape requirements are required, they have to be replaced.
Thank you. And just wanted to remind everybody that this is for Miami-Dade County properties, not specific counties like we're going to go over in a moment. So thank you guys, I appreciate it. Quatisha, can you please also introduce yourself and then maybe go some of the same questions?
Absolutely. But if you don't mind, I always like to take the opportunity when someone pronounces my last name correctly, I want to hear it again. So go ahead. Who am I?
Quatisha Oguntuyimbo Rashad. Did I get that right?
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I am Quatisha Oguntuyimbo Rashad with the City of Miami Environmental Resources Division within the Building Department. And this is a great opportunity. Thank you, LIF, for giving me the opportunity to provide some information from the City of Miami's perspective and how we, do business within our City of Miami and try to preserve our natural resources. I have been with the City of Miami for 22 years and within the Environmental Resources Division since 2013. That's when it was created. And our division is tasked with managing our urban forest, both on private and public property. And so with that, we have situations where we have storms, as we know, on an annual basis, and we have to respond accordingly to those. And we have trees that are impacted as a result of windstorms. Now, similar to Miami-Dade County, if there are any trees damaged as a result of a windstorm and they are effectively destroyed, then there is no permit for them for their removal. right? Or to remove the debris. And that's by ordinance, right? That is an exemption for those storm-related damaged trees. And the only way to, well, the best way to confirm those damages is in line with Lewis, what Lewis Moreno advised was documentation. We cannot stress enough the importance of documenting what damages taken place on a particular site, and this is from a private owner standpoint. Trees fell, documented, first and foremost, safety, right? Encourage property owners to, whatever they're going to do, make sure safety is priority. Document whatever trees have failed, contact a professional such as a certified arborist to help assess any damages. If it is urgent, if it's something that is blocking ingress and egress to your client's property, the city of Miami exempts any permitting to, for removing those types of trees or those types of conflicts or damages. Is there a cost for this? No, because again, there's an exemption there. And it's very important, again, to document, because trees that fail, they're removed right away. Stumps around it is removed. Later on down the line, we want to avoid any confusion, any code enforcement issues that may come about, that there was a tree on the property and now it is no longer there. What happened to the tree? Most of the time, the municipality, and specifically City of Miami, will require or ask for documentation to support the fact that trees or a tree was damaged and failed due to a windstorm. Do we have references for storm tolerance for trees and palms? Not at this moment. We continue to do assessments throughout the year to try to, identify the most suitable trees in our area that do well based on our soil and limited locations that we have in the right of way. But that's something that is ongoing. But at this current time, we don't have that list.
Thank you, Quatisha. All right, up next, we have the City of Coral Gables, George Rivera. I think you're there somewhere, right? I think I see you, George. George, I think you're muted.
Mute. Now, it was very close. It was very close. Normally, when people ask me, I don't have any preference to be called Jorge or George. As they said, it's pretty much the same parameters that the county and City of Miami have. But in our case, the difference is when trees are damaged, we will allow the removal of the tree that has lost 50% of the canopy or more. In case of not fallen trees, the still is standing, and we recommend that for, as Quatisha said it. Hi, Quatisha, by the way. As she said, it is, we will allow the trees to be removed. We recommend for them to use certified arborists as much as possible. And documentation, yes. In many cases, when we have trees that are onto the fall from the right-of-ways onto private property, the only thing that we will ask the homeowners is that they can sign an entry form, so for liability purposes. But other than that, it is very simple, very straightforward. And after the first 3-4 weeks, we basically notify the homeowner that there are requirements by zoning that at least should be maintained in the properties. In most of the cases, that requires one large shade tree in the front. Other than that, we are on the same page.
Thank you, Jorge. I appreciate it. All right, everybody. Up next, we have the city of Miami Beach. And again, we have the former forester, Omar Leon. Omar.
Thank you, Diego. As Diego mentioned, my name is Omar Leon. I'm the former urban forester for the city of Miami Beach. The group, thank you everyone for bringing me on board. And, I know you guys wanted to have me speak on some of the regulatory requirements for the city of Miami Beach, since I'm pretty familiar with it, and some of the policies that we have post-storm. Just to kind of add on to what everyone's been mentioning right now, within the city of Miami Beach, the code also has exemptions for those trees that have been effectively destroyed. As has been mentioned before, I think what I would caution and advise folks specifically to that municipality is that, they mentioned, documentation is key. We actually run, since we're not as large of an area, we actually run drones pre-storm and post-storm in anticipation of an event. And we run it post-storm, various times, through a cyclical period. And so, we have been able to document trees that were removed that were perfectly fine. You can clearly see them. There was no, there might have been minor damage, but not what we would consider, effectively destroyed. And there was no documentation, and we would, ask for more documentation on that. Also, we have to bear in mind, I think I want to add too, that, we have to think about ownership of the tree and who's the owner of the tree. Is it the property owner, or is it the right of way? Is it the city? So if a tree is damaged on the right of way, we definitely ask that, you do not touch that tree. Let that be assessed by the city and determine it. Let the city determine what's going to be the outcome of that tree. If it's going to be preserved, or it's going to have to be removed because it's been too damaged. And I think in addition to that, I think Jorge mentioned it too. You have to bear in mind what your zoning requirements are, because you may have minimum landscape requirements in your city, or on your property. And so you may remove a tree because it's been damaged, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to replace that tree. So you bear that in mind as well when you make those determinations. And I think having a certified arborist, essentially looking at your property on a cyclical basis is best. But if at a minimum, looking at your property post storm, I think is critical. They're certified arborists for the most part are going to be looking at how we can preserve these trees, and living in a subtropical climate. There's a lot of things that we can do from an industry standard to preserve and protect some of these trees post storm that you probably wouldn't be able to do in the northern climates. So we have to bear that in mind. And once again, if we can preserve something that's been there for years, even if it's needs some restorative pruning programs or whatnot, it's best to do that than they remove it just because it doesn't have a central leader or whatnot. And as far as costs for permitting and things like that, we when something is exempt from the code, we don't require any permitting costs. Where there are fees or costs or violations, or if things are removed and it's clearly seen that it was removed without proper documentation, without that proper permitting, just because the homeowner wanted to remove it, then there are fees associated with that. And as far as documents that are references to storm tolerant trees and palms, our urban forestry master plan does have as part of the toolbox in the matrix, they do list storm tolerance as one of the characteristics of those trees and palms. Um, Also, I believe the county has a pretty good document from a couple years back, and I think IFAS also has a document from a couple years back, I think done by Ed Gilman, that has pretty good references as to specific species and that have more storm tolerance. But at the end of the day, and I'm sure most people would here would agree, just because a tree is storm tolerant doesn't mean that it's not going to be susceptible to failure. And a lot of it has to do with how that tree is maintained and cared for. So, improper pruning practices over time do lead to other issues in the future, especially depending on the trees. So, we have to bear that in mind. But that's essentially all I have, Diego. And we can proceed.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Omar. Yeah, just a couple of comments just to add to that. I think just to piggyback on that last thing you said, the quality of the material coming from the nurseries are important. That's why the grades and standards are crucial. But I don't want to answer a lot of these questions. I kind of want to give it back to you guys. So I'm going to open this part up to all the panelists. So I'm just going to start shooting questions, and please, if you guys just jump in, and there's different points of view. We could definitely have 2 or 3 different people answer the same question or more. So thank you, everybody. So the first question for the whole panel is, does your particular city have a hurricane plan in place before the season starts?
So, I mean, I guess I'll start. But the city of Miami Beach, regularly updates its hurricane plan, and we actually run exercises, pre hurricane season, to see how effective that plan is, in different stages of storm, either preparation or post storm recovery. And based on what feedback we get from those exercises, we go updating the plan on a regular basis. It's a little bit different than what you would see in some other municipalities, but once again, the intent is to try to preserve as much of our existing tree canopy as much as possible, and be able to not have to go through extensive reforestation at the end. So, if we have decent quality trees that are, could be restored through restorative pruning, rather than having to replace it with, 1 or 2 smaller trees that will take years for them to come to a stage where they're providing benefit to the city. We're going to move forward and we're going to preserve that tree. And some of the stuff that we've done in our areas, you might not be able to do in northern climates, but they're perfectly fine. And we have a good success rate in subtropical areas. So I think like everything, there's a reason why those trees are here, and we do have hurricanes, but they're the trees are adapted to that. So it makes it helps us in the long run. So
I can add 5 cents to that. I would say, in my case, as a senior arborist and for the city of Coral Gables, it's pretty much, I'm very conservative about removing trees. And I always try to give the trees a chance, because as we can see in nature, even the worst damaged trees at some point will recover. But it got to be done in a certain way that will be safe, either for pedestrians or for the occupants of a dwelling. One thing that is quite interesting is that always the municipalities can, as the Southern District of the Forest Service, to help with some of the evaluation of trees, basically in right-of-ways, by using the strike teams. And that's something that you guys can actually be part of. I was fortunate to be I'm still a member of the Southeastern District for the strike teams. That's quite interesting. On the other hand, many of the times people will be in a pinch because there are not enough arborists in the area, when we only have about 129 I think I'm being a little optimistic about the number because I believe there's only like 89 to 100 certified arborists for Miami-Dade County. So if you try to balance the population of trees in the county, 129 arborists, it will be enough. So it got to be made clear either by a website or particular e-news or whatever media is available. Even sometimes you can go and get the help of the, for example, Miami Herald, to let people know what are these regulations, what they should look for after the storm, because you're gonna have a lot of residents that are gonna be in panic. You're gonna have a lot of people that be trapped in their houses because there's a tree on the right of way that fell in the front and they have 2-3 different trees in the back so they can get out of the house. So we got to understand and make them understand those situations, because the first thing that people will do is just pull the trigger on the trees. And so is the main component of this exercise is to educate people in these situations. And the sooner we do it as we approach the hurricane season, the better we'll be in communication with the residents, with the constituents.
Thank you, George. Anybody else?
I'm going to quickly jump in here and say, I know the city of Coral Gables is pretty, they stay on top of their trees because there's a Vera wood tree in one of the little city of Coral Gables parks on Ponce de Leon that fell twice during 2005 and once in 2012. And city of Coral Gables has propped that tree right back up all 3 times, and it's still there. Hopefully the next storm doesn't knock it down again, but Coral Gables does a good job, trying to save their trees. As far as the county is concerned, the county is massive. So there's a lot of different programs in the county, and even many of the programs that deal with trees. The county puts out every year prior to hurricane season a pretty robust, information, get ready, hurricanes coming. Not only do they send out pamphlets in the mail to all the residents, but there's a lot of media on radio and television ads, about getting ready for hurricane season. Certain departments like solid waste will also put out additional information related to, making sure people are not pruning their trees a day or 2 before a hurricane gets here. They probably will not be able to pick up the vegetative debris and therefore will become, flying projectile. So there's a lot of things that the county does to get the word out, to be prepared for hurricane season. At our end, just from our section, we're always preaching the right tree in the right place to try to achieve that sustainable and resilient tree canopy. But that's the information we put out there. It's just really trying to get the word out about trees. I know there's a lot of people panic. The hurricane season's approaching and we start getting the calls. A lot of people panicking, unfortunately they're panicking about a tree that's been in the ground 40, 50 years, that's lived through Andrew, it's lived through Wilma, Katrina, Irma, has lived through all these, but yet they get into this panic mode, and all of a sudden they see the tree as being a problem. And we try to educate them. Sometimes, as much as you tell them, it doesn't resolve. It doesn't alleviate their anxiety. But we try to tell them that regular maintenance of the tree, proper pruning, getting the tree to have a good structure. The tree's going to withstand. I mean, you can never guarantee that any tree is going to survive a category 4 or 5, but obviously taking care of the tree, making sure the tree is healthy and is properly pruned, will make the tree much more resilient in a storm.
I wanted to add something as well, at least related to the county. The county is big. The unincorporated areas is almost 50% of the county. There are suburbs being created all the time with development. And there's a difference the way the county manages tree resources versus municipalities. You might see in municipalities a more holistic approach, or at least a more condensed approach to action, where there's a combination of permitting and public works and maintenance and tree inventories. With the county, there are different elements at play. And it would be a mistake to think that, for example, Lazaro and I deal with tree permitting directly. We are responsible for maintaining right-of-way trees throughout the county, and particularly on county roads or county properties, which is done by a different department, a different group. The county has its tree inventory, and the RAM group that belongs to Park and Recreation and Open Spaces, PROS, they constantly monitor the tree assets throughout the county. They do all their tree risk assessments, and they have their routine for inspections, and they ask for permits to our group whenever a tree has been effectively destroyed or it poses a risk to persons or property, or a safety issue, or some conflict with road improvements. So it is important that the people understand that, because we might not have the same ability to respond immediately. And what we do most of the time is just to offer counsel. As Lazaro mentioned, the right tree in the right place, the importance of proper maintenance of these trees, the adverse effects of aggressive root pruning, which is something very typical, in competition for paving in the suburban areas, single families, people that want to expand the driveways, and they want to use the right of way as an extension of that driveway, and they just pave over, and all of a sudden those trees are completely unstable. They lost a portion of their root plate, and they might pose a tremendous hazard in a windstorm or flooding events. So I wanted to point out that there are other groups in the county, and depending on the type of report, they will be sent to our group for the permitting portion, or to the right-of-way people, RAM, for any unsafe tree that might need immediate removal or pruning.
Thank you, Louis. We'll move on. Patricia, go for it.
So the city of Miami has similar processes and procedures in line with our colleagues in other municipalities. And we do have PSAs that we put out while hurricane season is approaching. We have bulletins, we have our website that provides proactive guidelines, safeguards to adequately prepare for any storms, and how to maintain their trees throughout the year, but then any additional steps that should be taken right before the season approaches. Was again, safety first, making sure that you are in communication or know professionals such as certified arborists that you can call to or get some guidance and information on your trees and your property. In addition to that, City of Miami staff, we do coordinate internally with other departments. So RPW, Resilience and Public Works, our Parks Department, we do have internal meetings where we identify areas, right? These areas pretty much maintain priority throughout the year, but we make sure we target highly sensitive, highly vegetated, highly forested areas that may be impacted the most. So we make sure we have enough staff and resources to deploy to those areas in the event a windstorm is significant, And we have a bunch of resources that have been impacted. And one of those resources that we do reach out to is what George mentioned, which is the Urban Forest Strike Team. So we have taken advantage or reached out, to try to put that resource in place. And I'm actually in communication with, our region's supervisor, which is Will Reiner, and in communication to, try to secure resources with them so that in the event we need their assistance to help with tree risk assessments and identifying trees that we want to preserve, those resources are available. So we have different areas and different grids in place. We gather our resources and know how and what areas we need to deploy them to, whether it be our parks, whether we target our parks first, or whether we target our main arteries, which can have trees that are failed and blocking roadways, right? So we kind of get those things in line beforehand so that we know exactly what the game plan is as a result or post-storm.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next question for the panelists is what guideline recommendations do arborists use to decide which tree is going to be saved or removed?
Well, go ahead. Was that Quatisha, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, so I was it was a segue right into what I was saying. So post-storm, we do have criteria that we established beforehand, and we know what types of trees, the size, the condition, we have that mapped out. So when we deploy the Urban Forest Strike Team out to particular areas, or we have contractors and we reach out to companies such as Earth Advisors that helped us tremendously post-Irma, we have our mapping of types of trees that we want to preserve. And specifically, we want to make sure we target those areas and those trees right before FEMA makes their way around, because their guidelines is a lot more flexible, so to speak, meaning it doesn't take much for them to remove trees, right? It has to have a certain lean, it gets removed. So we get ahead of those, we get ahead of FEMA, and we have our teams to identify trees that are fairly young, right? That may be young, young trees that were just planted. The roots aren't so severely exposed or ripped or torn. What the condition is, the location. Location is critical because we know we have highly sensitive areas. So we want to try to meet the goal and effort of tree preservation in those areas as much as possible, because there's a vested interest by the community, whether it be the community, the municipality, to protect or preserve some of our transportation corridors, our highly trafficked areas. So it boils down to the species. It could be the species, the size of the tree, the risk, whether the risk outweigh the benefits, right? The risk benefit factor. If it's more costly to remove or more costly to preserve a specimen tree, right? We have to weigh our options. Do we want to preserve this specimen tree that may cost thousands of dollars to reset, and the chances of it surviving this type of detrimental failure? Does the city have the resources and the money to allocate to that, as opposed to taking those same dollars and preserving 20 of the newly planted trees that have a much higher chance of surviving the failure that's taking place? So we have to weigh those options out. It's really tree by tree, location by location, when it comes to deciding whether we want to make the effort to preserve a tree or consider it an unfortunate loss.
Yeah, I'm going to add a few things there to what Quatisha said. She definitely said some of the things I was going to touch on, but definitely, I think, I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit, because I'm going to rephrase it to, what are the, the guidelines that I would like to see arborists follow. And once again, I can only speak from my group. If somebody like from the RAM division was here, they can really tell you what they do after storms. My group is just a tree permitting program. We don't maintain the trees, we don't manage the trees, we don't remove them or those things. But what I would like to see, the arborists would, using their knowledge, would follow a comprehensive assessment of the tree that went down or is damaged, and determine if based on the damage that was done to it, if the tree got uprooted, are you looking at, just a horrible root system with girdling roots? That is just, the tree is definitely not going to be worth standing up again, because the same thing is gonna happen to it. Is there sufficient soil volume in the area where the tree toppled over? Sometimes you see a tree toppled over and the root system is like a pancake, because you look underneath and all you're seeing is compacted fill. You're not seeing anything else. The tree was planted probably in about a foot of soil, so all the roots have stayed on the surface. A tree like that is probably not worth resetting. And like what Quatisha touched on also, it has to do with if you're also now looking at private property or maybe even public property, the cost involved, especially if you're looking at really big trees, it can be very expensive, resetting a large tree, staking it. Is it going to be safe? Is the tree going to be a hazard? Even if even if you can properly stake it, some trees, especially if they're tall, their canopy's been lifted, may take a long time to establish and may need to be braced for a long time. And it's unknown what the outcome of that tree is going to be. So there's a lot of factors involved. So almost a comprehensive, assessment of the tree needs to be done. Obviously it will be more successful to reset smaller trees, especially if the root system is in good shape.
As I said before, we are very conservative in our approach to preserving historical trees, because most of the trees in Coral Gables, like the banyans and some of the oaks, they are kind of historicals, kind of we can call it heritage trees. And we got some of the cebas or the capox and the soda bombax that we look at every one of them as one-on-one basis, because we are, I would say, happy triggered sometimes to go and just remove trees. And we have the recon rescue team that does the first assessment right after the storm. We do that first assessment in the first 72 hours. So pretty much we know firsthand what is happening. So we have made some decisions to preserve certain trees based on locations, based on species, and not always, and we got to be clear, in many cases when we refer to other arborists, in the sense like we have specimen trees, but then it's in emergency cases, it's a fine line into what you define as a specimen tree based on the ordinance and what you consider a specimen tree in the field. Those are two different things, because under ordinance, most of the municipalities consider a specimen tree something that is beyond 18 inches in many cases. Other municipalities, they can say anything above 12 inches is a specimen tree. So if you got situations like that, and you have trees like they are 72 inches in diameter, they are older trees, I'm a big advocate of retrenching. And if I have the opportunity and have the chance to try to save a tree, we will try to do so. But that sometimes is done in partnership with the residents. Not only because we decided, it's because also we want the community to be involved in those decisions. Because I can give you an example. We had a big silk cloth that fell on San Lorenzo and Segovia. We did what we can in the first assessment, we decided, no, this tree has to go. But then because the input from the residents in those particular blocks close to where the tree was located, we decided, okay, we are going to try to save the tree. It's gonna take probably 10, 15, 18 years for the tree to start showing the real signs of recovery. And we are starting the process of monitoring that tree, and we are doing the proper pruning to try to balance the amount of new leaders coming out. All the epicormics that came out, that now they're big. So we need to make sure that those trees doesn't have even incipient decay on them, or in the where the cuts were made, because if that happens, we will need to remove the tree. So I think we are one of the few municipalities that we got at our disposal certain tools, and we are looking to obtain other tools to make a deeper assessment on the condition of those trees, let's say 5, 8, 10 years after the tree has been reset. But yes, we are a big advocate of giving the historical trees a chance, knowing that it's gonna take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work to do the maintenance of those trees to make them safe and to thrive. Just remember, the trees are very unique, intelligent, smart organism, opportunistic. And those trees, if you give them the chance, they will try to create new trees, because that's part of the normal reiteration of the species. So what you need to look at is, as Cotisha said, the cost benefit. Fortunately, we have the opportunity to use some of the funds from the Tree Trust Fund to allocate certain amount of money, so we can do certain special projects that we might try to save the trees. That it's gonna take a lot of work? Yes. It's gonna take a lot of time? Yes. But if you're willing to do, believe me, you can do it. Even in many cases, you leave a stump that is maybe 5 feet tall, and when you got all those epicorbids coming back and you start doing the pruning, that's nothing different when the tree follows his cycle in life and start declining and start going back, crumbling from the top, and new epicormids coming from the base. It is to some extent our duty to preserve some of those valuable specimens, but it will depend also on the budget your municipality has. So to me, everything falls into the arborist doing the assessment. Is the responsibility of the assessor to make sure that you're not creating a potential risk, but you are making a decision that it will help protect an old tree, that to reap the benefits of all that tree, because you might get cuttings and you might reproduce the tree if your organization is growing trees, or just condemn the tree and avoid a very slow death. Those are some of the parameters that we should consider when we are working with this old trees that happen in Coral Gables. So we have that issue with the old banyans, the old oaks, some of the old mahoganies. We saw a lot of damage in the last storm, Irma, but yeah, we got a lot of trees standing. We got a lot of trees that were preserved. Not the best way, because remember, when you are dealing when you start recovery through FEMA has very specific guidelines what they would allow you to try to recover from your expenses. So they can give you the system for that, but they got specific guidelines, what you can do or what you can remove or what you cannot remove. So those are part of my 5 cents to the conversation.
Thank you.
Right, and I think that's why it's important to establish those parameters and those thresholds beforehand, because when you start to have a number of professionals, out in the field to determine what should be preserved versus not, we know, you have as many guidelines in place, but decisions are still subjective, right? Just based on our own knowledge and experience in the green industry. And so that's why it's good to have those guidelines and parameters in place beforehand, because we know post-storm time is of the essence and we have to move quickly if our effort is to preserve as many trees as quickly as possible, and then having those parameters, you know exactly which trees to target, and then you move from there with all of the special characteristics and special things that take into consideration when you identify those certain trees.
Thank
Additional
you.
2 cents, additional 2 cents on top of his 5.
I wanted to mention something tangential. Now, I don't want to depart from the topic, but I don't want to miss the opportunity for all the arborists that are listening. At least in the county, and that applies to some municipalities as well. Our group also regulates natural areas. And we have a map for natural forest communities. In some of the municipalities, is restricted to some parks. And so you don't have to worry about it necessarily. But some of these natural plant communities that might be under some protection or not might fall in residential areas and some commercial areas adjacent to structures and buildings. And you might receive calls to remove debris, to remove trees from these natural areas. And it's important that arborists are aware of these natural components of these fragments in the urban setting, because that might not be exempt to get a permit to remove a tree that is located in a natural area. I understand that if there's an emergency, it has to be taken into consideration, similar to what, I don't know, FPL will do if they have a transmission corridor that goes through a natural area. I mean, safety first, but beware of the difference between a landscape tree and a natural tree. A tree in a natural setting, in a cluster, that might be protected under some sort of covenant or conservation easement, or is part of a natural forest community or a private environmentally endangered lands covenant. They don't have the same freedom or exemption from the county to go and remove trees. And the same applies when there's some storm damage on pinelands or hammocks, and people just bulldoze or clear it, as and the opportunity to remove debris or use it as a dumping site of debris post a hurricane. And so I want everyone to be cognizant of that difference between these natural areas and just trees on the landscape.
Thank you, Louis. Actually, that was really well said. That kind of led to another question that we had coming up. We're running a little short on time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to phrase a question, and then I would also like to leave it for our panelists to throw any comments you guys want to ask, because I'm trying to squeeze in a little bit of Q&A afterwards. So one of the questions we have is, what are the justifications for removal of a tree? And if so, how's it calculated for mitigation? Is it different in a single family or a commercial site? And one of the comments that somebody posted, we're talking about the Florida statute 163.05. So if we could maybe answer some of those questions, I think it'd be beneficial. And again, anything you want to add to that we haven't covered that you really want to voice out, please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that because it kind of builds off on the other question too. But at the end of the day, we need to understand that who. Well, I mentioned this earlier, but who is the owner of the tree? The owner of the tree is the private property owner or public property trees. The city, and therefore, what are the threshold of what's the threshold of that owner? And that takes into account the state statute and local municipal code. In the sense that if a tree is damaged beyond what's acceptable for a private property owner, then yeah, there could be justification there for the removal. And then once again, based on the code, and if it's proper policy, proper policy is followed per the code or per the state statute, there could be justification there for the removal without requiring any, additional mitigation or requirements or fees. Once again, on the public property side, what's our threshold? What is our goal? So, essentially, so each municipality, in the county or whatnot, has certain goals that they're trying to achieve, either through tree canopy percentage goals or other type of benefit goals. Um, you know, if we want to achieve those goals, we need to take certain, like Jorge had mentioned, certain actions to try to preserve trees, to a higher grade, or higher standard than what you would typically see in other places. Because if you're just removing trees every time there's a hurricane because a little bit of a lean or a little bit of a lift or it has some minor damage, we're never going to get to the goals that we're setting forth in South Florida. We're just not, and so we need to take a more concise approach in preservation of our existing tree canopy, and then of course proper maintenance throughout the years. I think one of the things that I remember, just briefly from Irma, as an example, which was the last storm that we had, and I mean, we all hope that we don't get anything this year either. But from before Irma, there really wasn't that many storms that had hit us since Wilma and Katrina, and so you had like almost 10 years of growth on trees in most places with no maintenance and no proper maintenance standards, and not all, but a majority of the failures that we were seeing around the city was related to old growth or growth that was growing, that was from an improper pruning cut or something from 5-10 years ago, which wasn't being maintained. So, preservation and maintenance is key, is what I'm trying to say. And, just bear in mind, what is the end game? What's the goal? Is the goal to have a flourishing, healthy tree canopy throughout the South Florida area? Or are we going to be content with replacing and trees on a regular basis every time there's a storm or some sort of catastrophic event like that? And that's essentially all I had to say.
I mean,
I would
to
like to
answer.
take it.
No, go ahead,
Alex.
Louis. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to mention just a sequence of situations for perspective that relates to how to treat different tree resources in probably the same property or related to the same property. And as arborists, we might face situations on a waterfront property, for example, and this could be city of Miami Beach or city of Miami, and you might have mangrove on the waterfront. I mean, there's 3 species of mangrove and the bottomwoods. They grow along the waterline, and they have a very special protection if they are, in tidal waters. And they grow to tree size. Some of them might be very close to a specimen. You might have in your backyard, just adjacent, continuous to this mangrove line, you might have trees are a specimen and were covenanted at the time that the property was developed, and they have special protection for that specimen covenanted tree. You might have just regular landscape trees that don't reach specimen size, and they might not need a permit as per the county minimum standards. You might have trees in your front yard on the same scenario as your backyard, and you might have trees on the right of way. And this tree in the right of way might be your responsibility to maintain. It's a tree that is essentially you will have to get a permit yourself if you want to remove, or and you are supposed to maintain it and trim it, or it might be on a county road, and the tree might be a county asset and is maintained by the RAM group from pros for the maintenance, and you might not have the ability to remove that tree or do whatever you want with that tree. So those, in that sequence, that's an example of how to treat trees differently. And as arborists, be familiar with the local ordinances or county ordinances and what we can do and how we have to document that tree resources and whether mitigation is needed or not. For example, with the mangrove, you need a professional mangrove trimming from the county in order to do any type of pruning on that tree. So it's important to keep these different levels of protection and ownership and responsibilities of trees in a property when we're going to offer services in the event of a storm.
I would say that in our case, we are in a very unique situation because we are one of the few municipalities that maintain the right-of-way trees. And is still, as owners of the public trees, every time that we want to remove a tree, we've got to go through the permit process. And when we condemn a tree, we have to conduct a tree risk assessment on that tree. So we are very unique because we got one of the, probably I would say, without fear of being wrong, we had the highest canopy coverage in the county. So we have to be extra careful how to protect the canopy, how to maintain that canopy. What step are we taking every day to preserve the canopy? So it's a very unique situation. And we try to be as strict as we can in order to assure that after the storm, we don't have fly-by-nights coming with chainsaws, cutting trees left and right. And that's the reason why we have a recon unit going out in the first 72 hours, because we want to prevent that. But it's still going to happen. And as Louis said, yeah, natural areas is a complete different situation, because normally you got to let them restore themselves through the natural process. And so in our case, we try to be as proactive as we can, but also we got to deal with the responsibility to help property owners in many cases. And we got the limitation that we have very limited staff. Our situation is very unique in that sense. But my advice for arborists doing reports is be as clear as you can. Don't send anecdotal reports. State the facts. Do your tree risk assessment. If you're not qualified and you're not trained to do it, find somebody else that can do it for you. Because instead of doing a favor to your client, you're going to be doing a disservice. Because you're going to delay the process. You might get into the problem that you might be getting the property owner into problems. And as I said, I mean, there's a new change in the law where you got to follow the track process in order to basically do your tree risk assessment. So for the arborists that are in the business, they gotta be prepared to face the new requirements. So for those who did advertise that they can write you a letter to remove a tree, I would say you better think twice. Because now there are different requirements, and those requirements are being evaluated by our legal department in order to make, if possible, more stringent regulations. So fly-by-nights won't be able to keep coming into the city and remove trees, because after the storm, it's a free game. So yeah, I think regulation got to be put in place and be informed. Basically, that's what it is.
Thank you, George. I was gonna let Lazaro and Quatisha try to wrap it up for us. We don't have much time left, so if you guys could try to be as concise as possible, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Diego, I wanted to bring it back up again because I think we wandered pretty far off of the question you initially asked. Can you ask the question again so I make sure we bring it back to what you wanted us to answer?
Understood. No, it was just we're trying to figure out what are the justifications for tree removal. And if so, what do we have to calculate for mitigation and justifications? I think the intent was, hey, if it's on the ground, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, but what about it's leaning, root damage, canopy damage? That was the intent. But I think there was a lot of good answers, but I think just because we're limited in time, I would say you're welcome to answer that. And if there's anything in particular that you want to voice your concerns out, because we have no time, please do so. And I want to make sure I gave Quatisha enough time. So if you could just be concise, would be appreciated. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm gonna quickly answer that. Once again, I want to go back and reiterate that I went ahead on the chat and posted the 11 municipalities that enforce their own tree code, and in which it's many of the municipalities that are here today. City of Miami, Omar used to work for the beach, and Coral Gables, they enforce their own tree code. Plus, they have much stricter standards than our minimum standards. So I just wanted to put that out there. Again, as far as when you're looking at just standard tree permit, you're not looking at what we're talking about here, hurricane damage and trees effectively destroyed. We categorize our trees into non-specimen sized trees, which are those that have less than an 18-inch trunk diameter or breast height, and then specimen sized trees, which have an 18-inch or greater trunk diameter or breast height. Those are the trees that our code states have to be preserved whenever reasonably possible. However, with that said, there are several factors that the code gives for you to justify, whether trees can be removed. Obviously the health, the condition of the tree, does the tree pose a foreseeable risk or danger to property? Those are just some of the things we look at on determining whether we can issue a permit for the removal of a specimen-sized tree. Obviously, there's tons of trees on our exempt species list and our prohibited species list that, regardless of size, we don't regulate. But just quickly on the state statute, there's extremely great changes happening to the state statute that are now going to take effect on July 1st. Based on the poorly written and very vague initial version that took effect July 1st, 2019. The version that's taking effect now, the revisions in July 1st coming up, are very positive. They clearly define what a residential property is, because before it was just a very broad, it can be anything. Now it just focuses specifically on what we like to call existing single family residence. So that's a huge one, because before it could have been anything from a vacant residential lot to multifamily common areas. Another thing they're making very clear is the actual documentation. Before it just says, documentation that the tree poses a danger to persons of property. Now they're clearly defining what type of documentation needs to be submitted. So that's another massive revision to the ordinance, and even a word that they changed that before said that the property owner must obtain the documentation. Now the ordinance was changed that the property owner must possess the documentation. So those are all very, very positive changes, which are probably going to lead to us receiving processing many more tree permit applications a year, but that's fine. They're very good and positive changes to the state exemption.
I just want to add something for the arborists and even for my colleagues in the municipal line of work. We are missing a big component when assessment trees, and one that I see missing in pretty much in all the ordinance is when people refers to leaning. We don't have threshold how we are going to approach a tree that is leaning 12 degrees versus 18 versus 22 versus 25 versus 28. I would suggest for the audience to look into Dr. Kim Coder writings about leaning trees, because I have found that it's very useful to have a guideline, because according to Dr. Coder, through many years of experience, trees that are at 18 degrees of leaning should be monitored constantly. But trees that goes beyond 22, and I'm being a little, I can say that I'd be a little generous about that. I can go up to 24 inches of leaning. I mean, 24 degrees of leaning, and before I condemn a tree, because after 24, the potential of failure of that tree will increase exponentially. And so that's one issue that it should be at some point integrated into the ordinance to prevent people abusing the leaning of trees as a reason as why you need to remove this tree. And that happens after storms also.
Thank you, George. Quatisha?
I just want to say, real quickly from a city of Miami standpoint, although the goal is to preserve and restore trees to the best extent possible, that goal cannot supersede public safety. And we try to make sure we have that secured and there's no concern with safety prior to moving to the next assessment of the efforts to preserve trees in our right of way. If there's doubt of the structural integrity, any jeopardy of that, then that is priority, and we take that into consideration first. In the event the unfortunate decision is made to remove trees, then we do have our Resilience and Public Works, our Parks Department that have post-storm, post-tree removal efforts to reforestation efforts, and we replace our trees, as much as possible. We canvass our areas, and we do our best, to mitigate in that regard. So that's what it boils down to when it comes to whether the tree needs to stay or go first. Is it a safety issue? It has to go. We can't. That's a risk that the city is not willing to have, or to own. And then we look at location and the cost efforts, the cost benefit ratio, and we try to preserve as much as possible.
Wow.
And always check the roots. That's it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, guys, I just wanted to thank all these panelists. I'm really amazed on the knowledge that you guys are sharing with everybody here. Thank you so much from LAIF. You guys have been amazing. Just want to remind everybody before we leave that there will be a survey. Please make sure that gets filled out. And we're going to try to send, following up to this seminar, some verbiage or link to the video, because there was a lot of good discussion here. And I just wanted to thank again the panelists. Thank you so much on behalf of LAIF for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Happy
All right,
Father's
guys.
Day.
Have a good one.
Happy Father's Day, everybody.
Pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Always a
Hi.
pleasure, Jorge, Patricia, bye, Henry and Diego. Mar, great to see you.
Hey, guys.
Take care. Happy Father's Day.
Have a
Happy
great one.
Father's
Likewise.
Day.
Bye, Henry.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right. Be safe.